Hello fellow cinephiles, 90s Film Guru here. Thanks for joining me today. So with the release of the new Crow, the reboot, sequel, whatever you want to call it, and it hasn't done real well, I decided to return to the original film. Now I didn't want to watch the original film before going into the new one because it changes kind of the way that I view particular films, being a remake per se. So I don't always want to do that because I want to go in with fresh eyes and make up my own opinion about the film without being swayed by anything else. And my reaction to that film was the same as everybody else's, I suppose. Now, so I decided to return to the original film. I've been sort of thinking about, ever since I saw the Crow reboot, I've been thinking about this original film and Brandon Lee and what this film was saying and doing and how great it was. So I thought I'd return to it. Now I hadn't seen it in quite a while, but it was still as good as I remember it to be. It came out in 1994. It was directed by Australian director Alex Proyas, I think that's how you pronounce his name, and was the final screen performance by Brandon Lee, who tragically died on the film. The film was based on a 1989 comic book series created by James O'Barr. Now, what I read this morning was that O'Barr created the comic because of the death of his fiancée who died at the hands of a drunk driver. So it's like he's trying to make sense of what transpired, what happened to him, and the effects of losing his fiancée. And that's exactly what this film kind of does. It really represents that and really shows the effect that it can have on one person. And I really love that about it. Along with Brandon Lee, you have Ernie Hudson and Michael Wincott. There's a variety of other actors in it who are really great. And obviously the actor who accidentally shot Brandon Lee is really good in the film as well. The film was made for $23 million and went on to make $94 million. So it was quite a successful film for a little independent movie that was directed by a director who hadn't really done a lot. And this was really a precursor to what Alex would do with Dark City. And there's a lot of references here. There's a lot of stuff in this Crow that he would use ultimately in Dark City. And you can't tell me that the Wachowskis weren't inspired by this film to create The Matrix. The leather, the way the character interacts with the world is very similar. And they created their own world much like Alex does with this film. It's all shot at night primarily, and we get to see this sort of city, this dark and twisted city that always seems to rain and is always dark. And it's all done with sort of model work. We do have a town, obviously, that the film's set in, but at the beginning we sort of fly around this sort of great little model version of the city, which is fantastic, and then ends up on this really great shot where we're introduced to Ernie Hudson's character, and also we find out what happened to Eric Draven and his fiancée Shelley. There's a lot of behind the scenes stuff that happened with this movie as well, that James O'Barr went to a studio to try and get his comic book series made into a film, and he didn't really like what they were trying to do with it. Originally they wanted to make it a musical starring Michael Jackson, which is really quite bizarre to me for the type of material this is, to have a pop star, or one of the biggest pop stars, shall we say, doing a musical version of it. I just found was strange, so he passed on that. The co-writer of the film, John Shirley, he ultimately wrote a script that was called Angry Angel. That was kind of felt a lot like The Crow, and then he decided that it wasn't picked up because of that, so he decided to read the comic book and decided to do an adaptation of the comic book in script form. And James O'Barr liked that. They came and worked together. Ultimately, John Shirley was replaced later in the film with clashing with the studio, and ultimately other writers came on to do rewrites. But his original vision and version of the film is still there. And then the casting of this film, originally, they wanted either River Phoenix or Christian Slater. I'm like, what? Like, I could not see Slater doing this. I really like him. But his sort of attitude, he sort of has a way about him that wouldn't really work for the Eric Draven character. River Phoenix, on the other hand, I could have seen him do something like this. But it's really Brandon Lee's film, with his physicality, how skinny and slim he is, his acting, how he's able to do his own sort of stunts in a lot of the film and injects a lot into it. I just couldn't see anyone else playing this role besides Brandon Lee now. Brandon Lee also did his own choreography in the fight sequences because he was a trained martial artist like his father was. And he sort of shaped certain things in the film, which is really great. And this is something I didn't know. I don't really want to get too much into his death because we all know the story and it's very tragic and sad, but I want to talk about things around that. So ultimately, there was, what I found out was only 3 days left of shooting when he died, and they sort of had to reshape the film in a lot of ways, do some rewrites, especially in this particular sequence where Eric goes back to the apartment after returning to the living from the grave. And that was all sort of Chad, who would go on to, direct the John Wick films, but Chad really was his stunt double, and he added a lot, and they digitized his face. And in this scene, you couldn't really tell. Well, you can tell when his face is digitized, but you couldn't really tell the difference between him and Brandon Lee in their physicality and what they do in this scene, which is really cool. So it's really cool he was able to come on and help finish the film because of that. The one thing I did want to talk about in regards to Brandon Lee's death is I remember when I heard about it, when I was much younger. I got sort of into him, through, he did a couple of films like Laser Mission, which wasn't great. He did Showdown Little Tokyo with Dolph Lundgren. And he's good in that. He's playing the wrong role, but he's still good in that film. And then it was Rapid Fire. When Rapid Fire came out, I thought that was the film that he last did and died upon, because I really liked that movie and I got into it. But then I found out later it was The Crow. And I remember seeing it, would have been on VHS. I don't think I would have seen it at the cinema. I saw it when it first came out. And I was really impressed by it. I liked the darkness. I thought it was a really interesting film. And I just got swept up into it and enjoyed it quite immensely. That is sort of my connection to it in a way, rather than anything else. And I kind of like that there is a bit of a history for me in regards to that. In the comic books, I think, I'm not 100% sure about this, there's a character called the Skull Cowboy. And he was really helping Eric navigate what was happening to him and his ability to walk in between worlds, and kind of explaining that to him, much like we saw in the most recent Crow, which was a stupid scene anyway, but it's sort of the similar thing. And they had shot some stuff for that, and it was originally going to be played by Michael Berryman from The Hills Have Eyes, and it only got cut when Brandon Lee died. But this is something that would have been kind of interesting to see, as it would have been his guide through what was happening to him, which would have been kind of really interesting for someone to explain. But then I started to think about the remake they did and how, like, they have someone explain everything, and it's kind of boring and dull, and it just a lot of exposition. And due ultimately to Brandon Lee's death and not being able to complete the film with 3 days left of principal photography, they reshaped it. So the young girl in it that he's friends with, that his fiancée Shelley looks after and is like her little sister, is the one who does a voiceover. She explains just small details in the idea of true love and tragedy strikes, that love never really dies. And so she explains a little bit of it. And I really liked that. It wasn't a whole heap of exposition explaining every little detail on what they have to do and how they came back and all that stuff. It was just a simple way of talking about it. And then ultimately it skips a year later, which I kind of think is interesting. In other incarnations of The Crow or the sequels that came out, it was always he came back straight away, or that character came back straight away. He'd die and come back. Where this took its time, and I kind of like that. It's like it was a year later, it's on the anniversary of what happened to him and his fiancée. He returns from the grave, and he doesn't really question anything. He doesn't say anything for this sort of first reintroduction of the character. He kind of just sees the Crow and follows it, like he knows what he needs to do without asking any questions. It's not blind, like he's blindly led, but it's like there's something about this Crow that makes sense to him. And then when he returns to his apartment and remembers what happened to him, that's when he puts on the makeup and fully becomes the Crow. There's just something really cool about the way they did that. The way time had passed, the way he returned, the way that he sort of embraced that particular side of himself to seek vengeance for what transpired for him and his fiancée, Shelley. It's just like he knows what he has to do. And I thought that was kind of interesting. And there's many things that I noticed through the film as well. They've just added things that they never really look at again. It just feels like after this film, they just didn't quite understand the story. They didn't understand the story they were telling. They didn't understand the essence of what the film and the source material was trying to convey. And they've just dropped the ball every time. It's just like every sequel has to be, oh, well, this person gets killed and comes back and seeks vengeance, and it's exactly the same thing over and over again. And the reboot is pretty much the same. It tries to add things, but it doesn't really do much in regards to expanding the story. It's like they forget what the point of the whole thing really is. Before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit about the Shelley character. Like, yes, we only see that character in flashbacks. In the new one, they try and show more of her, which doesn't work. But there is, at the start of the film, Eric's already dead, and she's dying, and they're rushing her out of there, and she's asking where Eric is, and we have these little moments where she's so concerned with him, and there's a sadness to that sort of thing, the fact that he's dead, and that she doesn't know it, but she's badly injured, and she doesn't know what's going on, and she wants him to look after the young girl, and there's all of these things, and even though it's a short scene, it sums up their relationship quite well as the flashbacks we do get, which feel very romantic and feel very of two people in love, which they really capture that, and I love that aspect to it. The things I did notice this time round, besides him just accepting what he has to do, is he has this ability to touch people's heads and see their memories. It's like he absorbs them into himself to see what happened. And he kind of does that with Ernie Hudson's character. Like, he's able to absorb that to see what happened, and he does that with Ernie Hudson's character to see what happened to Shelley and what happened to him. And it's really cool. And then he's able to use that later in the film when he goes up against the villain played by Michael Wincott, and ultimately injects that into him, and it sort of shocks him. I thought that was a great added element to it. It gives it a sort of supernatural thing, but it sort of gives it this power to giving the character some sort of abilities. And at many times in the film, I thought of Heath Ledger's The Joker. Like, it isn't, Brandon Lee's performance isn't as flamboyant as that character, and it's crazy. But just with the makeup and certain scenes, especially in the pawnbroker scene, just the way he's kind of funny and unique and interesting, and where he finds Shelley's ring by touching it, it's like, it really injects so much of the spirituality aspect to the movie and to his character, which I really loved. And also the fact, like, the crow and him are entwined, so everything the crow sees, he sees, and we get to see through the eyes of the crow, and then in turn, Eric gets to see what it's seeing. And I thought this was really great. It just sort of showed how this crow isn't just his guide, but it's sort of his eyes into this new world he's experiencing. And when something happens to that crow, ultimately Eric loses his ability to heal, but he's still willing to be that hero. But he couldn't accomplish what he set out to do without the help of Ernie Hudson's character appearing and helping him, and ultimately the final showdown between Eric and the bad guy shows him rising up against what's going on. So you look at him, yeah, he's killing people, it's revenge sort of thing, but he's kind of an anti-hero. Not quite as brutal as the Punisher, but a bit more like Batman. If Batman was a killer in the early films, and that's kind of what it feels, and there's a darkness to that, and I kind of like that. It's a character you can really get behind, and I think that's partly because the role that's been written, but also what Brandon Lee brought to the role. He just injected so much of himself in. The way he was really skinny and slender and muscly, the way he wore the makeup, had the long hair and dressed in black, and just how he pulled all that off, and also had the ability to have some more emotional scenes in the film than we get in the other incarnations of it, and I like that. Just him remembering Shelley and just sort of trying to recapture who he is now in this after all of this stuff has happened, and how he's walking the fine line between death and life, and how he injects so much into that. And it is definitely one of his best performances. And I think that if he had not died on the set, he would have gone on to do a lot of really great action films, maybe sequels to The Crow. And I think I would have loved to have seen him in John Wick, with Chad directing, and he was Brandon's stunt double, and just having them work together would have been really cool. There's something old about this film as well. Like, this is a city, it's its own world, and that's probably why. But when we get into the apartment at the beginning of the film, you've got all these police officers there. They're using old flash bulb cameras that you used to see in the 50s and 60s, and gives it that sort of noir aspect. It's very dark. The whole film's very dark, and he feels like a sort of a noir character, the Crow, in many aspects. And I like the way that it crafts this sort of lifeless, sort of dark world that never sees the day of light. We do have one scene in particular where we do see the film in the light, or a couple of scenes, and that serves a purpose, but mostly it's sort of dark and black and gritty, and the rain adds another sort of element to it as well. Those couple of scenes, when we do get daylight scenes, it's usually in flashbacks when we're showing Shelley and Eric together and in their relationship, and it kind of felt like those scenes, it kind of felt like those flashback scenes were really heaven, and where Eric is now is hell because of what happened to him, and he's lost the love of his life, and he's seeking vengeance upon the people who murdered them ultimately. And it's sort of, the contrast is really cool, and I like that. And if we had too many day scenes, it wouldn't have the same impact that it does in those sort of flashbacks. And I think the flashbacks sum up Eric and Shelley's relationship much better than the new Crow does in the 20 minutes it does to try and set those characters up. Even though he's dead and he comes back from the dead and he is killing these people responsible, there is still a bit of humanity to him. And that comes through when he's interacting with Ernie Hudson's character and the young girl. There's still part of him that is connected to them, and they form a really great bond and trio, and like a little family. And I thought that was really cool. It just sort of, having that there had a bit more impact when things went wrong, or things are transpiring, or he ultimately then Eric has something to lose because of the connection he has with those two characters. And I thought that was a great way to do it. Really the relationships that give this film a lot of heart, and the sort of relationship that we see between Eric and Shelley. There's some really cool sequences in it, some great practical effects, and like I said, miniature work. We get a miniature city at the start, which is really cool. There's some great explosions and fight scenes in it, and you can see Brandon using those skills he's had, his ability to flip up from being on the ground, and just the way he moves and interacts with characters in it, and really shapes those fight scenes is really cool to watch. And I think it's such a wonderful film. The only thing that dates the movie is the visual effects. Some of them don't look quite right. There's a scene where Draven gets shot in the hand and he puts it up, and we can tell it's fake, but it still looks cool, and then it slowly heals, but you can tell the hand's fake, and certain other sequences in it. But I like that because it represents that time and place when we used to see movies like this in the cinema, and these were the practical effects. These were the digital effects that we had at the time. So it's kind of reminiscent of that. I think Alex crafted a really wonderful film, and the fact that his lead actor died just before completion of the film, and his drive to finish the movie really made it something special. And I think that's what elevates Brandon Lee's performance here. As you know, it's his last, and he's giving so much of himself emotionally, that it just gives those scenes that we see with him when he's experiencing that much more power than we had before. And it really is ingrained. Brandon Lee is really ingrained with The Crow. It's like they are one. After watching this film, I started to think about all these modern movies that we get, and The Crow reboot is one of them, and just how they feel shallow and hollow, like there's no real depth to them. It's like filmmakers and writers today have lost the art of storytelling, of taking their time to build characters, to give those characters particular scenes in movies that sum them up effectively and easily, and really expanding on those characters as the film goes along, and relying on building those characters and then introducing the story. So we have something to connect to join to as the story unfolds. And filmmakers today, not all of them, there are still really great filmmakers and writers out there crafting really great films, but the majority of the movies I just feel hollow. and they don't spend enough time on the right things, or they introduce ideas and do nothing with them. Where in the 90s and earlier, when they were making films, it's like they were like pursuing these particular ideas that just come up in movies now, and they just touch upon, rather than investing that as part of the whole film or the whole story. And it just feels sad that we're going down this direction. What happened to the creatives? What happened to these creative storytellers who don't tell the stories anymore? And we get lumped with all these Netflix films that all feel the same, all the Marvel films feel the same, you know, all the Fast and the Furious, and all of these sort of big budgety things that we get now, and even the smaller films just feel reminiscent or the same as something else. And they sort of explain too much or don't explain enough, and we're just left wondering what the hell they're trying to tell us, who the hell these characters are and what they're trying to convey with them. They don't really know how to show or tell a really great character arc. It's another reason why the 90s is my favourite, is because it just felt like there was better storytelling. They understood what they were doing, and they executed it in a great way that allowed the audience to invest in the characters and in the story. There's many memorable scenes in it. One that got me thinking of The Dark Knight actually is where all the bad guys are having this meeting and then Eric appears out of the shadows, much like the Joker does. And it's a very different performance, obviously, but it felt very similar. It just felt like Nolan had seen this at some point in his life and was like, I like that, let's inject that into this. And his scene's very different and works in a different way, but they are very similar. And the other thing is too, all the villains in the film, all the guys he's seeking to kill for vengeance, are all distinct in some sort of way. David Patrick Kelly playing T-Bird. Now T-Bird's an odd character as well. And you've got Tintin, Funboy, Gideon, and Michael Wincott's character Top Dollar. And they're all distinctive, and they all have their own things. One's sort of a bit crazy and can't talk really well. One's more in control of everything that's going on. Another one throws knives and is a really violent character. And Michael Massee, who plays Funboy, is this sort of drug addict and sort of messing around with Sarah's, the little girl's mother, and sort of gets what's coming to him in a really interesting way. And it's just kind of interesting they do that. With the new one and the other sequels, they're not distinctive. They're just sort of run-of-the-mill. Like in the new Crow, like he murders all these guards, but they have nothing to do with the story. And the characters that are meant to be definitive or interesting are bland and boring. The only way a hero works, or an anti-hero, whatever you want to call the Crow character, Eric, is if the villains are as good. And if the villains aren't as good, then it's not going to work. Where the villains in this film were great. They all got, their deaths came, and Eric only kills them all in different ways, but they are sort of distinct and different and serve a purpose in the film and are characters that you want to see bad things happen to them, or you want to see what's coming to them. And that's another aspect of storytelling where you really got to make interesting side characters, not just focus on the mains. Overall, this is probably one of my favourite sort of gothic revenge films. Brandon Lee's fantastic in it. Alex Proyas does a fantastic job. It is fun and entertaining with a bit of heart and a bit of depth, and there's a sad tragedy to it. But overall, it's such a really fascinating film of a fascinating time based on an even more fascinating comic. There is sort of one sad thing that came out of it besides Brandon Lee's death, of course, and the effect on Michael Massee for what happened, is James O'Barr, after Brandon Lee's death, said that he shouldn't have created the comic. He was so stricken and so saddened by what happened. It reminded him of the death of his fiancée that he wished he never created the comic in the first place. That is so sad, because even though there was tragedy in this film in real life, there is a sense of moving on and accepting certain things that happen to them and going through the process of all of that transpires for particular people. And I think he shouldn't throw that away, because I think it's powerful in that, and I think people who've been through the similar thing would really connect to the material. I just wish he had a better experience with letting his material being brought to the big screen. In talking about letting go, one final thing, in talking about letting go, I really love the end of this film. You know, he's gone through all these stuff, he's killed all the people responsible, and he's lying there on top of Shelley's grave, asleep, thinking, what do I do now? And then we see this beautiful shot of Shelley, all in white. I think it was kind of meant to be similar, like, she looked kind of like an angel, but I think she was wearing a dress that kind of was similar to the wedding dress she was going to wear. And it's kind of, she comes to him and says, it's, you know, it doesn't say anything, but she's ultimately saying, it's okay. You've done what you've done, now we can be together. The sun is out, it's light, and she's this glowing, powerful force that just comes and whisks him away. And we're left with just the two graves. It's like this really poetic and beautiful ending to such a tragic film, to just acceptance of what has transpired. It's a beautiful moment, and the film is filled with so many great moments like that. I highly recommend this film if you haven't seen it, and I would give this film 4.5 out of 5. I think it's a wonderful movie, and it's really, returning to it now just gives it so much more than what I had previously experienced or the way I had seen that through the film previously. Anyway, that's it. That's my review for The Crow. Let me know in the comments what you thought. Anyway, that's all from me today. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please subscribe down the bottom, follow me on Letterboxd and Facebook. Otherwise, until next time, enjoy the movies.